You won't believe this story. An HOA president called 911 to report an ambulance because it was in her own private parking spot. Little did she know that this action would lead to her downfall. Stay tuned for this dramatic story where a power abuser finally gets what he deserves. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Now let's dive in. It was a perfect Saturday morning in Maplewood Heights. The sun shining through the red maple trees, the birds chirping and the distant hum of lawnmowers, the air smelling of fresh grass and wildflowers. The uniform houses, neat yards, and spotless driveways, all made for a picture-perfect order. But after 3 months of living here, I realized that this perfection was not accidental. It was maintained by the iron hand of Linda Cartwright. 3 days after moving in, I encountered Linda for the first time. For leaving my trash out past the designated time, I received a warning the next morning from the HOA. Section 5, Clause 3. Trash must be taken out within 4 hours of collection. First violation will result in a warning. Repeat violations may result in a fine. It was accompanied by a clear photo taken by Linda herself. At first I thought it was a minor incident. But in Maplewood Heights, no mistake goes unnoticed. The next week I was cited for a wrong-colored mailbox, then for an improperly rolled-up garden hose. When I got a warning for a worn welcome mat, I realized Linda wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was enjoying it. Linda Cartwright, president of the Homeowners Association, not only monitors but enforces the rules, sometimes to the point of extremes. At 55, with a perfectly cropped blonde bob and a pastel cardigan, she is never far from her clipboard, her constant companion in recording all resident violations. In Maplewood Heights, if you see Linda approaching with a clipboard, you are almost certain to be warned, reprimanded, or fined. Anyone who has lived long enough in Maplewood Heights has a Linda story. A person was fined for planting the wrong kind of flowers. A young mother was warned because her son's bike was leaning against the fence for too long. Even the most obedient residents could not escape her eyes. Under Linda's watchful eye, the neighborhood operated like a precision machine, and any deviation was dealt with immediately. No one dared to criticize her publicly, because Linda's power in the HOA was too great. But although everyone feared her, no one truly loved her, because behind the facade of enforcing discipline for the community, there was actually a thirst for personal power. Still, I could not have imagined that Linda's control would reach the insane level that occurred that day, the day she was willing to call 911 to report an ambulance for daring to park in the parking space she had reserved for herself. After 3 months, I got used to Linda's warnings, but that didn't mean I accepted them. At first, I thought the rules were just for policing, but I soon realized it wasn't about city cleanliness, but about power. Linda wasn't enforcing the rules for the good of the neighborhood, but for control, and it seemed that I, the newcomer, had become her special target. I remember the second time I was warned. That afternoon, after a long day, I was relaxing with a cup of coffee on my porch. When I checked my mailbox, I saw a warning clipped to the doorknob. The reason? My mailbox was dark gray instead of the standard light gray. A subtle difference, unless you looked closely. But Linda, of course, noticed. It was accompanied by a quote from the HOA bylaws that I had never heard of. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. A week later, I got another warning, this time for not coiling the hose properly. Linda said it should be coiled and hung at the correct height, whereas I had just left it on the lawn. I couldn't believe I was being told off for something so small. But with Linda, no detail was too small to handle. The climax came when I was warned about my welcome mat. One morning I found a note pinned to my door with a photo of evidence Linda had taken of my mat that was slightly worn at the corners. According to HOA Article 8, Section 2, welcome mats must be in good condition, not worn. I laughed. A fine for an old mat? But I wasn't alone. As I talked to my neighbors, I discovered that everyone had a Linda story. A neighbor who got told off for planting the wrong flowers, an elderly woman for placing a potted plant in the wrong spot, a young family whose bicycle was leaning against the fence for too long. Linda had turned Maplewood Heights into her own kingdom, where she oversaw every detail. What makes people angry is not just Linda's harshness, but also her favoritism. Some residents, mostly HOA members or people close to her, seem immune to her harsh rules. I once saw a house across the street leave a beach chair in front of its door for a week without being warned. Another time, a pickup truck was parked overnight in violation of HOA rules, without a warning. Clearly, the rules only applied to those Linda wanted to target. I knew that confronting Linda was a mistake many had tried and failed to make. A resident filed a petition against her that was dismissed without reason. A woman complained about an unreasonable fine, only to receive 2 more warnings the following week. Linda didn't just monitor, she retaliated. I became a prime target, constantly being called out for seemingly harmless rules. But I had no idea that Linda was about to make a huge mistake. One so big that the entire neighborhood would turn against her, and it all started when she called 911 to report an ambulance rescuing someone. After 3 months of Linda's surveillance, I had gotten used to checking my front door every morning for more warnings, but that day there was no warning, just a worried call from George, my elderly neighbor who lived 2 doors down. He was 78 years old, a widower, and lived alone in a small house with a rose garden that he tended every day. I usually helped him carry groceries and prune the plants, but this morning his voice was weak and broken on the phone. "I don't feel well. My chest hurts a little." I didn't hesitate. Telling George to stay put, I called 911 and rushed over to his house. George sat in a chair, one hand on his chest, breathing heavily. Although he tried to appear calm, he was clearly in pain. I kept him awake with a few stories while listening to the ambulance siren in the distance. In less than 5 minutes, the ambulance pulled into Maplewood Heights and stopped in front of George's house. 2 paramedics quickly jumped out and checked him, one taking his heart rate, the other preparing an oxygen tank. I stood aside, worried. I didn't know how serious George's condition was, but the fact that he had called for help was a bad sign. At that moment, all I was concerned about was George's safety. But not everyone else was. When I looked up, I saw a familiar sight that made my stomach clench. Linda Cartwright, her face full of annoyance. She wasn't worried about George, nor did she ask. Instead, her eyes were fixed on the ambulance, her lips pressed together, her hands gripping her clipboard as if she were ready to write a warning. I could sense what was coming before she opened her mouth. I had seen Linda get mad over little things like trash left out, hoses not rolled up properly, old carpet. And now here she was, an ambulance parked illegally in front of her own space. I hoped she'd understand this was an emergency, even if only for a moment, but I'd overestimated Linda. She couldn't ignore a violation, even if it was a life-saving vehicle. Her hands were clenched around her clipboard, her knuckles white, her eyes filled with unreasoning irritation. She didn't care about George. She didn't care about the paramedics working so hard. To Linda, it was all just another violation that needed to be dealt with. I'd lived here long enough to recognize that look. Linda was about to act. I'd seen her do it before, when I forgot to roll up the hose, when the trash was left out too long, when the mailbox was not up to par. But this wasn't a worn carpet or a bicycle leaning against a fence. This was an ambulance saving an elderly man's life, and Linda didn't care. Linda strode toward the ambulance, her feet pounding the pavement with frustration, breaking the silence of the neighborhood. I saw her take a deep breath, her chest heaving as if she were trying to control herself, but I knew it wouldn't last. And then, as expected, she exploded. I didn't need to hear every word to know what she was saying. The tone was stiff, authoritative, emotionless, and familiar. She pointed directly at the ambulance, her face contorted with rage, repeatedly mentioning HOA rules, private parking, serious violations. Linda acted as if this vehicle were a major threat to the community, not a vehicle trying to save a life. At first, the paramedics ignored Linda. They were focused on taking George's heart rate, placing him on a stretcher, and attaching the ventilator. They had no time for trivia. But Linda was not one to be ignored. She moved closer, her voice growing louder and more shrill, as if repeating her complaints would make them more important. I couldn't believe my eyes. A man might be having a heart attack, an ambulance was on the move, and Linda was concerned only with a parking space, a space to which she had no legal claim. Anger flared in my chest. This was no longer an obsession with rules, this was inhumanity. Linda had been so blinded by her small power that she was willing to obstruct an emergency situation just because of a rule she had made. I clenched my fists, my indignation and anger rising. I wanted to do something, to say something, but before I could open my mouth, Linda had crossed a new line. A line that even she could not turn back from. She pulled out her phone, her fingers quickly and decisively dialing numbers. I felt my heart stop for a moment as I realized what was happening. Linda was calling for an ambulance. I couldn't believe it. I'd seen her do some pretty ridiculous things before, but this was a whole new level of insanity. I stood there, frozen, barely able to believe what I was seeing. Linda Cartwright, the woman who had ticketed me for rolling up my hose the wrong way, for having an inappropriate mailbox color, for having a slightly frayed welcome mat, was calling 911 to report an ambulance saving lives. At first I told myself she was just threatening, trying to force the medical staff to yield to her absolute control. But then I saw her put the phone to her ear, her face serious as if she were reporting a serious crime. I could faintly hear her voice rising, unnaturally tense. It was clearly a switchboard operator on the other end of the line, and I couldn't imagine what they were thinking when they received this call. Amidst a series of emergencies, car accidents, house fires, real SOS calls, they now had to listen to an angry woman complaining about an ambulance parked in the wrong place. The tension was building. The paramedics, who had initially ignored Linda, now realized what was happening. One of them, a man in a blue uniform with a medical badge on his sleeve, turned and looked at her with a stunned look. He said nothing, but the way he took a deep breath and shook his head said it all. But Linda didn't care about those looks. She was in a state of complete obsession, as if everything around her no longer existed, just her and the rules she believed had to be enforced at all costs. I saw her stand up straighter, her chin raised as if she was confident that she was doing the right thing. I could read every word she was saying. "There is a vehicle parked illegally in our neighborhood. I asked them to leave, but they refused. This is a serious HOA violation." I almost wanted to laugh, but the anger inside me was too great. It was no longer annoyance or power obsession, but a blatant abuse, a kind of inhumanity that was hard to believe. And then the unthinkable happened. Linda's face changed. She frowned slightly. Her eyes blinked faster, as if she had just realized something was wrong. I understood immediately that the operator had asked her to confirm the type of vehicle she was reporting, and Linda, left with no choice, had to admit that it was an ambulance. I couldn't hear the reaction on the other end of the line, but I could imagine the stunned silence of the operator as she realized this call wasn't a prank. They must have been confused, unsure how to handle such an absurd situation. But Linda didn't stop. She gripped the phone tighter, her voice urgent, as if she were trying to justify her actions. And then, in a dramatic moment, she suddenly blinked faster, her face stiffening. I didn't know exactly what had happened, but there was only one possible explanation. The operator had transferred her call to the real 911 line. Linda had accidentally dialed the emergency number to report an ambulance was rescuing a patient with a heart attack. I saw one of the paramedics chuckle and shake his head, as if he couldn't believe the situation. The other, who had been serious at first, now stood with his arms crossed, looking at Linda with a mixture of annoyance and contempt. I wanted to scream, to tell Linda that she was doing something incredibly stupid, but I didn't have to, because she was realizing that she had just made a huge mistake. Her eyes were wavering, her hand holding the phone was shaking slightly. This was no longer a minor complaint to the HOA. This was abuse of emergency services, an act that could be prosecuted. But instead of stopping, Linda forced herself to hold on. I heard her say something more into the phone, but her voice was no longer as strong, as firm as before. Then suddenly, a change came over her face, one of pure terror. I didn't know what the operator had said, but I was sure of one thing. Linda Cartwright had just made an irreversible mistake. I could see the moment Linda Cartwright realized she had gone too far. The stiff confidence on her face turned to confusion as the voice on the other end of the line, though I couldn't hear it clearly, didn't react the way she expected. Instead of agreeing or promising intervention, she must have been warned about the misuse of the emergency line. She backed away, her lips pressed together, the hand holding the phone shaking slightly. But instead of admitting her mistake, Linda clung to her authority, still arguing that HOA rules were absolute and that even ambulances couldn't be allowed to violate them. But this time, she couldn't be ignored. One of the paramedics, a man in a dark blue uniform, finally spoke. He stepped forward, unhurried but clearly at the end of his rope. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of someone who had seen too much nonsense in his job to care about trifles. Linda turned to face him, but this time her usual confidence was gone. I couldn't make out the words, but from the way the paramedic pointed to the ambulance, then to George on the stretcher, I knew she had just been warned about obstructing emergency services. And it was the first time I saw Linda Cartwright actually hesitate. She was silent for a few seconds, as if trying to collect her thoughts, but her eyes were filled with confusion and fear. For perhaps the first time in years, someone had not been overwhelmed by her HOA power, but had instead made her realize that she was in real trouble. Residents began to gather. Some had heard the noise, others had looked out their windows, curious about the strange confrontation between the ambulance and Linda Cartwright. But the most important thing was not the number of witnesses, but the presence of phones. I was not the only one who realized that this was a moment that needed to be recorded. A woman standing nearby started recording. A man in the distance raised his phone, and even I pulled out my phone and pressed record. I knew the power of evidence, and if there was one thing that could topple the power Linda had built over the years, it was this scene, an HOA president trying to stop an ambulance over a fictitious parking spot. Linda, of course, recognized it immediately. She turned, her sharp eyes scanning the people filming, as if trying to intimidate them with her gaze, but this time no one was afraid. If before people had feared her retaliation, now anger overcame fear. Linda turned to me, perhaps because I was closest and had my phone raised most clearly. She opened her mouth, maybe to shout something that might have been some nonsensical clause from the HOA rules, or maybe a command for me to stop. But before she could speak, a sound cut through everything. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The paramedics had done their job. George was stabilized, oxygen was administered, blood pressure was checked. There was no reason for them to stay here any longer. One of them got into the driver's seat, flipped the switch, and in the next moment the lights were flashing and the ambulance was moving. Linda, as if she hadn't yet accepted defeat, hurried back to the phone. I could hear her speaking faster, her voice strained, as if she was trying to convince someone that the ambulance needed to be punished before it left. But of course, that wasn't happening. The ambulance sped up, sirens blaring again, and disappeared down the road. George, now safely inside, was on his way to the hospital, and Linda stood there, watching in despair. She was out of control. Everyone saw it, and most importantly, it was recorded. I put the phone down, but I didn't immediately turn off the video. I looked at Linda, and I saw the expression on her face change. It wasn't anger or frustration, it was pure fear. She knew she was out of control, and this time, no HOA warning would be enough to save her from the consequences. Linda Cartwright stood there, still clutching her phone as if clinging to a glimmer of hope. But nothing could save her. The ambulance had left. The paramedics had sounded the alarm, and most importantly, it was all recorded. Video from my phone, from neighbors, from witnesses, all became irrefutable evidence. I didn't hesitate. As soon as I entered the house, I immediately sent the video to the entire HOA board, along with a detailed description of the incident. But I wasn't the only one who took action. Other residents who had been bullied by Linda for years also began filing complaints, spreading the video throughout the neighborhood. Within an hour, the incident had taken Maplewood Heights by storm. Less than 2 hours later, a notice was emailed to all residents. The HOA board has called an emergency meeting tonight. Subject: serious violations by HOA President Linda Cartwright. I sat on my porch, staring at my phone, my coffee cold in front of me. This meeting was unlike any HOA meeting before. It wasn't about the color of the mailbox or the placement of the trash can. It was a trial of Linda Cartwright, who had thought herself untouchable for years. That evening, I arrived at the community center earlier than usual. Normally, HOA meetings rarely had more than a dozen people, mostly older residents or those reluctant to attend out of fear of Linda, but this time the room was packed. There weren't enough plastic chairs, and many stood against the walls or sat on the windowsills. Anger was in the air, and it was all directed at one person. Linda entered later than usual. Gone was the imposing figure with her clipboard and her low-heeled shoes clicking on the floor. She looked smaller, her shoulders hunched, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for an ally. But there was no one. Howard Bennett, the HOA board president, an older man with a deep authoritative voice, stepped up to the podium and banged his gavel on the table. Silence fell over the room, as no one wanted to waste time on routine. There was no discussion of maintenance, no financial reports, no rules that Linda had imposed on everyone. This meeting had only one purpose: to deal with Linda Cartwright. Howard simply listed the charges against Linda, starting with the unauthorized establishment of private parking spaces, then the repeated issuance of invalid warnings, and finally the most serious, the call to 911 to report an ambulance on duty. No one spoke as he spoke. No one spoke up to defend Linda. And then Howard asked the question that everyone already knew the answer to. The HOA board has reviewed the evidence. We will vote immediately should Linda Cartwright be removed as HOA president. I didn't have to look around to see the result of the vote. A series of hands shot up, almost in unison. I saw that those who had feared Linda, who had reluctantly accepted her rule, were now strong enough to resist. And then Howard slammed the gavel down on the table again. The decision has been made. Linda Cartwright is removed as HOA president, effective immediately. The silence in the room was broken by a burst of applause. It started in one corner and spread throughout the room, louder than any HOA meeting before. No one was hiding their joy. No one was scared anymore. Linda stood still, as if she still couldn't accept the reality. But this wasn't just a vote to remove her from the HOA, Howard continued, his voice more serious and heavy. In addition to the removal, the board has contacted the local authorities regarding the misuse of emergency services. A formal investigation will be conducted. The room fell into an eerie silence. This wasn't an HOA issue anymore. This was a legal issue, and Linda Cartwright knew it. I looked over and saw her lips pressed together, her hands gripping the strap of her bag, her face pale. She had lost all power, all control, and now, perhaps, all freedom. She tried to say something, maybe an excuse, a weak protest, but no one wanted to hear her anymore. Linda was no longer the one who enforced the law in Maplewood Heights. She was just a woman who had lost everything, standing in the middle of a room full of people who had been her victim. Linda Cartwright stood still, her hands clutching the strap of her bag as if it were the only thing keeping her balance. There was no longer any fear or apprehension, only indifference, relief, and a little gloating. Linda's years of ruling Maplewood Heights with clipboards and meaningless warnings were officially over. Applause broke out, sporadic at first, then bursting into cheers of welcome. Residents who had lived in fear, who had endured unreasonable rules, now enjoyed the moment of liberation as a real victory. I saw a man who had been warned for planting the wrong flower shake hands with an old woman who had been harassed by Linda for her potted plant. Strangers now laughed and shared joy, as if they had just gone through a battle together. The meeting ended, but no one was in a hurry to leave. Some residents suggested holding a small party in the community center to celebrate Maplewood Heights' freedom from Linda Cartwright's shackles. I watched as glasses of apple juice were poured, a box of cookies was shared. There was no big party, no cake, no fireworks, but the atmosphere was joyous. Freedom, even in a small neighborhood, was something worth toasting to. Leaning against the wall, I took a sip of water, looking at the smiling faces around me. Linda Cartwright had lost her power, and she would never have it back. But the story wasn't over. The abuse of power was only part of the story, and her calling 911 to report an ambulance was still under investigation, and no one would be surprised if Linda faced more serious consequences. The next morning, as I sipped hot coffee on the porch, I saw a police car pull up in front of Linda's house. An officer got out carrying a manila envelope and knocked on the pristine white door, which was always immaculate by her own HOA standards. I couldn't hear the conversation inside, but when Linda came out, her face pale, I knew she had just received official notice of the investigation. As the officer left, Linda stood silently on the porch, clutching the envelope in her hand. She looked down at the street that had once been her domain, at the neighbors who no longer bowed to her, then slowly turned and closed the door. And with that closing, an era ended. That day, Maplewood Heights became a real neighborhood, no longer held captive by a petty dictator, no longer ruled by unreasonable rules that existed only to satisfy one person's power. And I knew that from then on, no one would let another Linda Cartwright into the world.